Alexander the Great. An arrow went through his armor, through his chest wall, and into his lung, and his own army had already started mourning him before he opened his eyes again. 326 BC. The siege of a Malian stronghold in what is now Pakistan. Alexander, furious that his men were slow to scale the walls, jumps down into the fortress alone. An arrow punches through his breastplate and into his chest. When his bodyguards finally reach him and pull the shaft free, air and blood bubble out of the wound, the unmistakable textbook sign of a punctured lung. In the ancient world, that was fatal. There was no surgery capable of reliably closing that kind of injury. Alexander stops breathing. He collapses. 4 days away, his main army receives the news: the king is dead. The camp erupts in grief and panic. Who leads them home from the edge of the known world if Alexander is gone? He isn't gone. Physicians manage to cut the arrowhead free, triggering a violent hemorrhage that knocks him unconscious again, and somehow he claws his way back. Weeks later, still too weak to walk, Alexander has himself carried down to a boat on the river so his men can see him with their own eyes. When he raises his hand to wave, the army that had already started grieving him roars. He never fully recovered. Every breath for the rest of his life came from a chest that had been perforated by an arrow and torn open again by a rescue surgery. He kept leading armies anyway. The man who conquered most of the known world by 30 almost died at the bottom of a nowhere fortress wall, saved less by medicine than by sheer refusal to stay down. Some historians believe this was the wound that started killing him slowly, years before the fever that finally took his life in Babylon. A perforated lung in an age with no way to treat it properly doesn't just heal clean, it leaves scar tissue, weakness, a body quietly running on borrowed time. If that's true, the siege of a city most people have never heard of may have set the clock on the end of Alexander's entire empire. If you're into stories like this, hit subscribe. This channel's full of them. Henry V. A 16-year-old took an arrow to the face and lived long enough to become one of England's most legendary kings. That's not exaggeration, that's the medical record. July 21st, 1403, the Battle of Shrewsbury. Prince Henry, commanding a division of his father's army at just 16 years old, is struck beside the nose by a bodkin point arrow. The shaft is pulled free, but the head stays behind, buried 6 inches deep, lodged in the bone at the base of his skull. He doesn't fall, he stays on the field until the battle is won. Then the real danger starts. In 1403, a wound that deep, that close to the brain was a death sentence. Not from the impact, from what came after. Infection killed more medieval soldiers than blades ever did, and an open channel 6 inches into a man's skull was as good as an invitation. Enter John Bradmore, royal surgeon and metalworker. Bradmore didn't have antibiotics. He had ingenuity. He built a set of hollow, screw-tipped tongs designed specifically for this wound, small enough to fit the tunnel the arrowhead had carved. Then, day after day for around 20 days, he packed the wound with honey, a natural antiseptic, whether or not medieval doctors understood why it worked, and slowly, carefully widened the channel until the tongs could finally grip the arrowhead and draw it out. Henry lived. He carried the scar for the rest of his life, a permanent dent in the face of the man who would go on to crush the French at Agincourt 12 years later. Here's the unsettling part. If Bradmore had been slower, clumsier, or simply unavailable that day, there is no Henry V. No Agincourt. No Shakespeare play. English history pivots on one surgeon's honey and a screw mechanism, applied to a teenager who never should have survived the first hour, and Henry never hid the wound. As king, he wore the scar openly, and contemporaries read it as something close to a mark of divine favor, proof that God had personally intervened to keep him alive for the throne. A near-fatal arrow wound became part of his royal image instead of a secret to bury. Genghis Khan. Before he was Genghis Khan, he was just Temujin, a young chief bleeding out from an arrow to the neck, kept alive through the night by a friend who wouldn't stop sucking clotted blood out of the wound. The setting is a battle against a rival Mongol faction, years before Temujin unites the tribes. An arrow fired by the enemy archer Jay, who would later switch sides and become one of Genghis Khan's greatest generals, strikes Temujin in a vein of the neck. The bleeding won't stop. He grows weaker as the day goes on, and by nightfall he's in serious trouble, camped within earshot of the very enemies who nearly killed him. There is no surgeon, no antiseptic, no hospital tent. What he has is Jelmi, a loyal companion, who spends the entire night with his mouth pressed to Temujin's neck, sucking out the clotted blood to keep the wound from choking off his airway, and swallowing or spitting it so the enemy camp nearby wouldn't see how much blood their target had lost. Field medicine, 13th century Mongolia, pure improvisation, powered by loyalty. By midnight, Temujin revives enough to ask for something to drink. Jelmi, half-naked and unarmed, sneaks into the enemy camp itself to steal him watered yogurt because there was no milk to be found, risking his own life a second time in the same night. Temujin survived. He would go on to unite the Mongol tribes and build the largest contiguous land empire in human history. And the man who kept him alive with nothing but his own mouth and nerve became one of his most trusted generals, Proof that in this era, the difference between a forgotten tribal skirmish and the birth of an empire came down to one person refusing to let a wound finish the job. There's a strange coda to this story. Gibi, the very archer who put the arrow in Temujin's neck, later walked into his camp and openly admitted to shooting his horse in the same battle, offering his loyalty instead of hiding. Temujin didn't execute him. He recruited him. The man who nearly killed the future Genghis Khan ended up leading his armies across Asia. Theodore Roosevelt. A man was shot in the chest at point-blank range and responded by pulling out his notes and finishing his scheduled speech before he'd let anyone take him to a hospital, October 14, 1912. Former President Theodore Roosevelt, campaigning for a third term, steps out to greet a crowd when John Schrank fires a revolver into his chest from a few feet away. The bullet tears through Roosevelt's overcoat, punches through a folded 50-page speech manuscript in his breast pocket, and cracks a steel eyeglass case behind it, both objects slowing the round just enough that it lodges in his chest muscle instead of tearing through a lung. Roosevelt doesn't know any of that yet. What he does know is that he's just been shot. He checks his mouth for blood, reasoning correctly that if he isn't coughing it up, his lung probably isn't hit, and decides he's fit to continue. He gets in the car. He goes to the auditorium. He opens with, "I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose," and then delivers the better part of a 90-minute speech, bleeding through his shirt the entire time, before finally agreeing to go to the hospital. Doctors examine the wound and make a call that sounds almost careless today: leave the bullet where it is. Removing it is riskier than living with it. That bullet stayed in Theodore Roosevelt's chest for the rest of his life, through the rest of the campaign, through the years afterward, until his death in 1919. He lost that election. He kept the bullet anyway, a permanent souvenir of the day he decided a gunshot wound was a scheduling inconvenience. Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson walked into a duel knowing he was going to get hit, deliberately let his opponent fire the first shot, and still walked away the winner, carrying a bullet by his heart for the next 39 years. May 30th, 1806. Logan County, Kentucky. Jackson is dueling Charles Dickinson, a man widely regarded as the finest pistol shot in Tennessee, over an insult to Jackson's wife. Jackson knows he cannot outshoot Dickinson in a fair contest of speed, so he makes a brutal calculation: stand still, absorb whatever Dickinson's shot does to him, and trust himself to get off an accurate shot afterward. However wounded he is, Dickinson fires first. The bullet slams into Jackson's chest, cracking ribs and lodging just inches from his heart, close enough that surgeons would never risk removing it. Jackson doesn't go down. He clamps a hand over the wound, stands his ground, and raises his own pistol. It misfires. Under the dueling code of the time, that should have ended it in Dickinson's favor. Instead, Jackson recocks the weapon and fires again. This time it works. Dickinson dies of the wound. The bullet stayed lodged by Jackson's heart for the remainder of his life, through his military campaigns, through 2 terms as President of the United States, causing chronic pain and a persistent cough that doctors could hear through a stethoscope decades later. He died in 1845, 39 years after the duel, the bullet never removed. Jackson survived by making a cold bet with his own body that whatever Dickinson's bullet did to him, it wouldn't stop him from pulling the trigger one more time. He won that bet and carried the proof in his chest for the rest of his life. Richard the Lionheart. Now flip the story. Same wound location as Henry V, same era of primitive battlefield medicine. Completely different outcome, because this time the surgeon was not good enough. March 1199, the siege of the minor castle of Chalus-Chevreau in France. Richard the Lionheart, one of the most famous warrior kings in English history, veteran of the Crusades, is casually inspecting the walls without full armor when a crossbowman named Pierre Basile puts a bolt into his left shoulder near the neck. At first, it does not seem serious. Richard tries to remove the bolt himself and only makes it worse. The wooden shaft snaps off, leaving the iron head buried in his flesh. A surgeon is eventually brought in to finish the extraction, working in bad light, and botches it. Fragments of the bolt remain lodged in the wound. Within days, the flesh around it turns black. Gangrene sets in. There is no honey treatment here, no 20 days of careful daily cleaning. The infection spreads fast. Richard bequeaths his kingdom to his brother John, forgives the crossbowman who shot him, and gives instructions for how his body should be divided and buried. 12 days after taking a wound to almost the exact same region of the body that nearly killed Henry V, Richard the Lionheart is dead at 41. Same category of wound, same era of medicine. One king got a surgeon inventor with a screw-tip tool and honey. The other got a rushed extraction and poor lighting. That is the whole difference between history's most impossible survivals and a footnote about how kings actually died in the Middle Ages. Not the wound, the hands that treated it. Pierre Basile, the young crossbowman who fired the fatal shot, was reportedly forgiven by Richard on his deathbed, and then, depending on which chronicle you believe, flayed alive by Richard's furious mercenary captain anyway, the moment the king stopped breathing. Even Richard's mercy could not outlive him by more than a few hours. Sitting Bull. Long before the bullets that finally killed him in 1890, Sitting Bull had already survived being shot as a teenager, the first of several near-fatal wounds that shaped his reputation as untouchable, decades before his luck ran out for good. As a young warrior in his mid-teens, already riding alongside his father on raids, Sitting Bull was struck by gunfire during a clash with a rival tribe. The wound was serious enough to leave a lasting injury he carried for the rest of his life, yet he didn't die, and he didn't stop fighting. Wounds like this became part of the pattern that built his legend, a man other warriors began to believe could not be permanently stopped. That reputation followed him through decades of resistance against the U.S. Army, through his role as a spiritual and military leader at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, through years of exile in Canada, and into his final years back on the Standing Rock Reservation. By the time Indian police came to arrest him in December 1890 over fears surrounding the Ghost Dance movement, Sitting Bull was a man who had already absorbed gunfire once before and lived, a survivor by reputation as much as by fact. This time, there was no surviving it. In the chaos outside his cabin on December 15, 1890, Sitting Bull was shot in the chest and head by the same police sent to take him into custody. He died instantly. The irony writes itself. A man whose early brush with death became part of the myth of his invincibility was ultimately killed not in the battles that made him famous, but in a dawn arrest gone wrong. The one wound his reputation for survival couldn't talk him out of.